Welcome into another edition of Hand Raised Guys, presented by Comer Heating and Air, Southern Air Conditioning and Heating. I'm Neal McCready. Today on the show, I'm joined by Michael Bratton, host of That SEC podcast. We'll talk a lot about the upcoming Southeastern Conference football season, and he's got quite the hot take about one of Ole Miss's SEC West rivals. I don't think you'll want to miss it. But first, let me tell you about Comer and Southern. They've got different names, but they offer the same people, the same great products, the same great services. If you live in Oxford, Batesville, or the surrounding area, call Comer 662-801-1777. If you live in Hernando, Memphis, or the surrounding area, call Southern 662-429-4429. It's hot. If you have AC problems, you're going to want it fixed fast. And that's where the service comes in from Comer and Southern. They're absolutely fantastic. And please make sure when you get in touch with them that you tell them that you heard about them here on MPW Digital on the podcast. This will be the Friday Oxford Exxon podcast, Oxford Exxon Highway 6 West in Oxford. Great place if you're coming in or out of town to stop and fill up your vehicle and also fill yourself up. They got ribs for the weekend, both wet and dry. Always a great beer selection. Everything inside, always clean, always convenient, always great service. Plate lunches during the week as well at the Oxford Exxon Highway 6 West in Oxford. I'm coming to you from the Clark Ford Studios. Give my friend Corey Clark a call, 662-257-1900 there in Amory, Mississippi, and he'll give you a quote on the Ford product that you're interested in. It's right to the bottom line. There's no hassle. There's no haggle. You get to quote, and the rest is completely up to you. You can shop that quote around, or you can do what I've done, and that's hop into a Clark Ford today. Again, 662-257-1900. Michael Bratton and all guests join on the MyPerfectFranchise.net hotline. If you're a displaced corporate executive wanting to put your career in your own hands, you're an experienced entrepreneur looking to diversify, Andy Ludicky can help. He owns multiple franchises and businesses and uses his expertise to help others find their American dream through a very thorough and free consultation process. So call Andy. Put your life and your career in your own hands. It's 100% free. You got nothing to lose. Find your perfect franchise at MyPerfectFranchise.net. Or contact Andy anytime at andy@myperfectfranchise.net or 404-973-9901. We're also brought to you by BetterHelp. It can be tough to train your brain to stay in problem-solving mode when faced with a challenge in life. But when you learn how to find your own solutions, there's no better feeling. A therapist can help you become a better problem solver, making it easier to accomplish your goals, no matter how big or small. I've used therapy. It's a way to handle stress, clear negative thoughts, mentally relax a little. If you're thinking of giving therapy a try, BetterHelp is a great option. It's convenient, it's accessible, affordable, and it's entirely online. Get matched with a therapist after filling out a brief survey. Switch therapist anytime. When you want to be a better problem solver, therapy can get you there. Visit BetterHelp.com/MPW today to get 10% off your first month. That's BetterHelp.com/MPW. Our next partner is Athletic Greens. I take AG1 by Athletic Greens literally every day. I gave AG1 a try because I wanted better gut health, sustained energy, immune system support, and I hate taking pills. I take AG1 every afternoon to break my fast. I love knowing I'm doing something good for my body, giving my body the nutrition it craves, covering my nutritional bases. Covering my nutritional basis for the day literally couldn't be easier, which is why I trust Athletic Greens. Just one scoop of AG1 with water, and you're done. Also like that it costs less than $3 a day. It's pretty good if you ask me. It's a really effective daily habit with the highest quality sourced ingredients. If a comprehensive solution is what you need for your supplement routine, then Athletic Greens is giving you a free 1-year supply of vitamin D and 5 free travel packs with your first purchase. Just go to athleticgreens.com/MPW. That's athleticgreens.com/MPW. Check it out. Now here is Michael Bratton of That SEC podcast. Michael Bratton of That SEC podcast, kind enough to spend some time with us here on this Thursday night as we're taping it Friday morning as you're listening to it. Michael, how are you?
Hey, doing great, Neal. Really appreciate you having me on. Big fan for a long time, and anytime I get to come on a show that I actively listen to, it's always a treat for me. So it's a pleasure to be here.
Well, the pleasure is mutual, so I really appreciate that you saying that. That's very kind. I'll get to some stuff with football season. I'll get big picture things out of the way first. There's all sorts of talk about NIL and what I refuse to call it that. I'm working on refusing to call it that. I'm trying to call it what it is. It's like walking outside and the sky is blue and you say the sky is gray and it's not. It's blue. Just call it blue. It's pay for play. It's salary. It's going to be a big talk. The SEC people had their SEC on Capitol Hill thing recently, and they're talking about needing regulation and all of that stuff. I get that they need it. I get that they want it. Do you share my opinion that Congress is probably not going to take this on the way that the SEC wants it to?
The fact that they are essentially throwing a Hail Mary to Congress lets you know where they're at, I mean, they're out of options. They have no options. They have no good options, I guess I should say. And, honestly, Neil, I mean, when people start talking about this subject, I just gloss over and I'm ready for the next thing to
Yep.
go on because this is the way it is now. And the NCAA, college athletics, they've had about 100 years to get this resolved. And realistically, they've had more about 20, 25 years. Yeah, I was in middle school when I found out that the NCAA was making $1 billion a year to annually televise the basketball tournament. And I sat here saying $1 billion, and it's gone up since then. And with these TV rights deals and these coaches making all this money, and it costs a family, an enormous amount to go to these games to pay for parking, concessions, merchandise. I mean, it's pro sports is what it is. So this was going to happen eventually. And if we want to not pay the players, let's scale back what we pay the coaches, what tickets cost, what TV revenue, what they get paid for that, on and on and on. When we resolve all those issues, yes, let's go back to not paying the players, but you just can't have a multi-billion-dollar business and that money not get filtered down through all aspects of it.
With this talked about as much as it is, do you anticipate fans getting a little burned out on it, or is it still that deal when football season rolls around, people get excited and they just sort of forget it and go on with it?
I never, one time did I hear someone, when we were watching Bryce Young go bananas last year, did I hear anyone say, well, you know how much he's making? You know what I mean? Like it's never a topic of discussion while the season is going. So, no, I don't think it's that big of a deal. And I think the fact that Nick Saban has been kind of against it, Kirby Smart in spurts has been against it. There has always been NIL. They just called it something different back then.
Yeah.
And now it's across the board. And heck, I've heard Lane Kiffin kind of complain about it as well. I think his complaints is more about, Judkins getting recruited, even though he's not even entered the transfer portal. But I also remember Kiffin saying, hey, thanks for all those Auburn rumors because now we got NIL money to spend. So it's like you can't have it both ways. And I really like the fact that I think NIL, while it's not going to be even across the board, college football has never been even across the board. Just look around the SEC, Tennessee, Arkansas, Ole Miss, LSU, on and on and on. These programs have been helped tremendously by NIL, and I think it has somewhat leveled the playing field. Without NIL, I don't think Josh Heupel's team wins 11 games last year. I can tell you that for sure.
I love your setup. It makes me think about a couple of things. I see the Texas helmet. I see the Oklahoma helmet, which means we got one last year of kind of what I call nostalgia, the way we've kind of gotten used to it for a while, and the two divisions, and they'll meet in Atlanta and all that stuff. It's the change that's coming a year from now is off the charts. Like, we're going to go to SEC Media Days in your town, Nashville, in about a month. There are rumblings about next year being in Dallas or whatever. I don't know where it's going to be, but Texas and Oklahoma are going to be at Media Days a year from now. It's going to be one of the big stories, the 12-team playoff, all that kind of stuff. Are we going to kind of this season go through the year going, oh, this is kind of nostalgic?
Yeah, I think so because for a lot of programs, and I'm thinking A&M, and I think Ole Miss, I could throw into this boat, Kentucky, and maybe Vanderbilt. I think those are the only four that have never won a division title.
Yep.
So, hey, this is your final shot right here. You know, so I think there's something to be said for that. I think there is something to be said for the last time you're going to have this schedule that you do have. But I think that's a great thing because I'm the biggest SEC homer there is, but the scheduling is just a train wreck. And I mean, Georgia and A&M may as well not even be in the same conference the way it's structured now. It's ridiculous in my opinion.
I'm
And
with
I
you
think,
completely. So let's go here though, because you're right.
uh,
We're doing this 8-game thing next year, which I think is I get the argument. I'm about the fans. You're like you said, you're asking people to pay more money.
right.
You're asking people, hey, also contribute to collectives or whatever. You're
Hmm.
asking a lot, and then you're like, oh, and by the way, we're not going to give you that 9th game. That we're not going to give you the extra game that we kind of talked about. Do you think that's just a bargaining thing from the SEC, or do you think that the whole hey we have to stay at 8 from a playoff standpoint is going to ultimately win out over time? Because all they've committed to, Michael's 1 year.
Right. Well, it's interesting, Neil, because I said that about a week before the Destin meetings, and people jumped on me that they were going to stay at 8. But just everyone I talked to, I didn't talk to a single person that was convinced that they were moving to 9. So, I kind of saw where this was going a little bit ahead of time. But yeah, I mean, money is ultimately the biggest factor. But I've kind of gone both ways on this because I am firmly in the 9 camp. At least I was. And it's because of these rivalry games. How stupid is it going to be if Texas and Texas A&M are in the same conference finally once again, and they don't play each other? Alabama, Tennessee, Georgia, Auburn. We can go on. Those are the big ones, but there's others that we want to maintain, and getting to a 9-game schedule gets you there. But also, I've kind of been swung. I don't know if you know Dave Bartu, CFB Matrix, but he's kind of swung me back to 8 in a sense because it really depends on where your priorities are. And personally, my priorities are not the college football playoff. I cannot stand in the preseason when everybody's got to unveil their 4 and we got to talk about the playoff the entire season because I think what that does is that diminishes. There has not been one Egg Bowl that has had playoff ramifications. Not that I can think of. Maybe 2014 had some, but I don't believe it did.
Not playoff. It had some. Um, access bowl ramifications, but it didn't have the winner
Right.
wasn't going to the playoff, right? Right.
But my point is, does that diminish the Egg Bowl? In my mind, no. In my mind, the Egg Bowl, that's probably my favorite annual game in the SEC. That's why I love college football because I love the hatred. I love the in-state fighting. I love 364 days of talking and bad mouthing, and then once a year we get to meet on the field, and it means everything to that state. That's why college football, in my mind, is great. That's kind of why I like the 9-game model, so that we can have more of these games. And I realize even in an 8, even if they only played one conference game, they're still going to play the Egg Bowl. But point being is, I favor those games, so I favor a 9. But as Bartu explained to me, and he talks, he gets paid by some of these SEC schools to advise them. Staying at 8 makes a ton of sense for the playoff, and more specifically to have more entertaining games. Because if Alabama and LSU meet and they're 10-0 apiece, that game just seems like the biggest game in the world. The more we throw on losses onto the schedule, each team in the SEC, not only is it tougher for them to reach the playoff, but their resumes take a big shot. And the playoff committee does not look at, did you play 8? Did you play 9? What they look at is how many top 25 victories do you have? How many wins do you have over teams that have won 7 or more games? And that is all going to be downgraded in a 9-game model. So to me, it really just comes down to, what is the priority? Does the SEC want to have more teams in the playoff? Because a lot of fans, it's unfortunate in my mind, but that's all they focus on is the playoff, the playoff, the playoff. And we're just going to do more of that when there's 12-team playoff. Or do you favor rivalries in the regular season, which I do? So, I mean, you win either way, but I don't know. I kind of rambling here. I hope I answered your question.
You did. I just the idea of, like, we'll use Ole Miss as an example, since the 90-something% of the people that are watching this right now are Ole Miss fans, probably. The idea of the Ole Miss LSU game not happening, And maybe they work the schedules out where they do. But if they work the schedule out where all of these games consistently happen, that means Ole Miss might play Texas once every 6 years or whatever. And then like you said, you're not even really in the same conference at that point. I mean, if you never play that team, or if you never go to Austin, or you never go to Norman, or you never go to Athens or Columbia, South Carolina, are you really in the same conference with those teams? I mean, I guess you are technically, but you know what I mean. You're not. It doesn't feel like it. There's no rivalry there. It's just a novelty. Oh, this is the year that we play South Carolina. Right. We won't do it again for 6 years. So I guess, that's not really what rivalries and stuff are built on. If you had the 9 game where you played every team in the league twice, at least every 4 years, well, you can build some stuff up that way. You can build traditions and rivalries and things that make college football fun, frankly.
Right. And I think they could still do that, though, in an 8-game model. It would just, you'd only have one permanent, you rotate the other 7. But that is a must, because perfect example, Ole Miss and Tennessee don't play that often. But man, I was in Neyland Stadium last time Ole Miss came through, and believe me, every other year Ole Miss and Tennessee play, as long as Lane Kiffin is there. That is going to make for one hell of a football game, and it's like a travesty that they're SEC opponents and they never play. So we've got to do that. I mean, new rivalries will be formed. Yeah, maybe we don't call them rivalries, but just new biannual games that everyone's going to be looking forward to. And Ole Miss Tennessee is right near the top of my list.
That was a hell of an environment. All right, let's talk SEC West, since Ole Miss is trying to get to Atlanta, get one last shot to do it the traditional way. I look at the West, Michael, and I know that we all by default just go Bama because they've dominated it for 15 years. But it's a part of me this year that, I mean, I haven't declared my vote yet, but I think if I voted today, I'd put LSU number 1 in the West. They're just sort of the team that attracts my attention. And I look at Alabama, and I know they have talent everywhere, but they don't have Bryce Young. They don't have anything resembling Bryce Young at quarterback. And what sticks out in my mind from a year ago was the game in Oxford in November. Ole Miss was 8-1 at the time. Alabama came to town, and had Bryce Young not been Alabama's quarterback, had they literally had any other, well, outside of maybe Caleb Williams, had they been anybody else at quarterback, even some good quarterbacks, Ole Miss wins that game. Bryce Young won that game for Alabama. And Bryce Young won several games last year for Alabama. He was a difference. Alabama didn't blow people out all year long. Alabama didn't blow out Texas. Alabama didn't blow out Texas A&M. Alabama didn't blow out Arkansas. Alabama didn't blow out Ole Miss. Alabama didn't blow people out last year. Those were close games, and a lot of times close games that Bryce Young won.
Right, and you're a smart guy, Neal, for liking LSU, because that's who I like as well. But, here's the secret. I don't know. People just think I'm a hater. No, I have been known to troll from time to time, but it's clear as day to me that Nick Saban, he's the greatest of all time in my. I don't even think that's debatable at this point. But he has lost a step, and when I say that, there's 2 reasons. The defense is not nearly as dominant as they've been, and they've not been for many seasons. When it really crystallized for me is when Clemson put up, 45, 48 points in a national championship game. They don't slow down good offenses. If they're facing a good quarterback, they can't slow him down either. So that has really triggered something in me, and we see this time after time after time. And secondly, Alabama has just been so dependent on 2 things, and that's having great quarterbacks, which credit them for getting them on campus, but also outstanding play calling on the offensive side, which again is not Saban's forte. And as soon as we saw what that program is with Bill O'Brien, it's with the best quarterback in the game, in my opinion. It's still, they did not stack up to Georgia. Hell, they lost to Tennessee, lost to LSU, probably should have lost to A&M if not for god-awful Jimbo Fisher's play calling there on the goal line. Texas, their quarterback went down. They could have lost that game had Ewers not gotten hurt. I mean, this is troubling, and this is multiple years in a row where they do not play well on the road. There's I mean, they're shattering Alabama records for penalties in a game, and they're doing it multiple times a season. Alabama still one of the best, but not the juggernaut that they were.
Yeah, I'll go one further. If you go back and look at the part of the season last year when Bryce Young got hurt and was out, and they had average play calling and a different kind of quarterback. When Bryce Young went down, it was in Fayetteville. It was second quarter, if I recall correctly. I had just covered Ole Miss. I'd covered Ole Miss, Kentucky that day. A great game. And when I got back up to the press box to write, the TVs had changed to the Alabama-Arkansas game in Vaught-Hemingway, and it was a blowout. Alabama was blowing Arkansas off the field. I want to say like 28-0 or 28-7 or something. So I looked up, saw that, and I'm like, well, that's not close. And I sat down and started writing, trying to get done. And got into what I was writing, filed, published, looked back up, and the game is significantly closer. I don't remember the exact score, but I think Arkansas had pulled to within a score, and Alabama was facing a third and long or something. Bryce Young had been knocked out of the game, and Milroe makes a big play, and they end up winning that game. But the point was, without Bryce Young, the game at Arkansas got squirrely. Without Bryce Young, the Texas A&M game was, like you said, I mean, it was a Jimbo Fisher stupid play call away from a loss. And it was a game that they probably should have lost. They needed Bryce Young to win games against, I mean, it was an Arkansas team that went 6-6. That was an A&M team that went 5-7. Those were not the crust of the SEC. And without Bryce Young, Alabama struggled in those games. I'm just, not only am I fairly sure I'm not picking them first, I'm not sure I'm picking them second. There are three teams in the SEC West that in different ways have my attention. One is Ole Miss because of what they have coming back on offense with Judkins and Dart and experienced offensive line. They got some question marks at wide receiver, but everybody's got question marks somewhere. I can't believe I'm going to say this out loud, but every year I feel like I sort of drink the Texas A&M Kool-Aid a little bit, then I get exposed and I have to apologize for it. But they're a really talented team on paper. They've recruited at a really high level. And then in some ways, and I'll get killed for this too, in some ways, Arkansas reminds me of Ole Miss a little bit. There's a lot of production coming back on offense, a big-time running back, a good front. And then, like Ole Miss, they really are dependent on a bunch of transfer portal guys on the defensive side of the ball. And, you know, maybe that works. Maybe it doesn't. But if it does work at Ole Miss and or Arkansas, those are teams that have a chance to be really good.
Yeah, if only Texas A&M. I love the talent. I love the coaching staff, minus the head coach. If they could just get around their head coach, I mean, they legitimately could win the national championship. I mean, they are that caliber of a roster. Now, I have more confidence to them finishing in the bottom half of the SEC West than I do the top, but that's just because they're a complete, could go either way. I mean, Bobby Petrino coming back, I think that was a stroke of genius. I really do, because that'll take the play calling away from Jimbo. Let Bobby not have to worry about recruiting and NIL and all this. Just call plays, coach up our quarterbacks. Jimbo Fisher for the life. I mean, he gets touted as this quarterback guru since Jameis Winston. He's not had a good quarterback since, and that was nearly a decade ago. So, I mean, that could be the move that puts A&M over the top. I got no confidence in it one way or another, because, I mean, I don't even know if Petrino will be there by the time the season starts. I mean, he could be fired for God knows what, but that's kind of the biggest mystery team, I think, in the entire SEC is Texas A&M.
Yeah, I agree completely. I'm mad at myself as we talk about this right now. I do this every year. I'm like, man, you look at that roster and there's just so much talent on it, and there is.
Mm-hmm.
It is so talented. They've got athletes just at every position. I like the quarterback, Weigman. I liked what I saw from him a year ago at times. Now, he wasn't great, but you saw him do some things where you're like, oh, that kid's got a lot of potential. And the criticism is always about Jimbo and his play calling, which is legit. But nobody can criticize Bobby Petrino as a play caller. I mean, he is an elite play caller. He's an elite offensive mind, much the same way kind of Kiffin is as a play caller. I mean, those are people that are at the absolute top percent of play callers in all of football.
Mm-hmm.
And the thing I know about Petrino is that if Jimbo doesn't let him call the plays, he's going to leave.
Yep.
He's just going to walk away, at which point Jimbo gets exposed and A&M boosters go, okay, well, that's it. We'll eat the money if this doesn't work out. And I don't think that's what Jimbo wants. So in some ways, even though Jimbo's the head guy and he's got the $70-something million buyout stuck to him, if he wants to be the coach there, he almost has to let Bobby Petrino be the offensive coordinator.
Yeah, and worst case scenario, if they do struggle, and again, I don't know how realistic it is to fire him with that buyout and all that, but you could do a heck of a lot worse as an interim coach than Bobby Petrino. I mean, imagine if they drop, the Miami game, it's week 2, and maybe they drop one more, they fire Jimbo, and then they don't lose another game. I mean, you almost have to give Bobby Petrino the full-time head coaching job. Don't you? I mean, I think that's got to be in the back of his mind. From what I understand, he's dying to be a head coach at a high level. Once again, that's why he took his job. I'm not saying it was specifically to overtake Jimbo, but if A&M does well, he's going to have his opportunities, I have to imagine, this offseason.
I would think
But
so.
it's interesting, Neal, the two teams you didn't hit on, Auburn and Mississippi State. I would agree with you. I'm more confident that they'll be the bottom 2 of the West next season, but it wouldn't stun me if they're not. I mean, Mississippi State seems to annually exceed expectations. I love Mike Leach. I honor Mike Leach with his book here, front and center of my studio. So I'm not trying to besmirch him or anything, but I think it's fair to say his offense was not all it was cracked up to be at Mississippi State. And we're bringing in Kevin Barbay, who led Appalachian State offense. They upset A&M last year. So this guy, and from all accounts, he's going to bring explosiveness to this offense. I think he was top 25 most explosive passing attack in the country, pushing the ball down the field, something that we did not see from Mike Leach. Zach Arnett, I think he's a great defensive coordinator, complete unknown as a head coach. So, again, I'm fairly confident to say they'll be at the bottom, but again, they bring back Will Rogers. They bring back a lot on offense.
Mm-hmm.
And I got so much faith in that defensive staff. Wouldn't surprise me if they overachieve. And then I'm not telling your audience anything they don't know, but Hugh Freeze, he's capable of pulling an upset or two. We all remember the Alabama wins. For some reason, everybody forgets the Vanderbilt losses. So it's like he can surprise you. He can disappoint you. I mean, he'll be inconsistent, but I think he has done a masterful job in his first off season of reloading that roster via the transfer portal. They're essentially going to have an entire new starting offensive unit aside from the running back that they got out of the portal. So how will that work? I'm not convinced that, the SEC West is a rough place to get your footing. But if they find their footing, the last 4 or 5 games, aside from the Iron Bowl, very winnable. So Auburn, they could struggle out the gate, but I think they could catch fire at the tail end of the season, if that makes sense.
Yeah, look, I've said this many times. The job that Hugh Freeze did in year 1 at Ole Miss was one of the very best coaching jobs I've ever seen. It was an elite coaching job. That they inherited a team that had gone 2-10 in 2011, that had a myriad of off the field problems, just had no culture to speak of. It wasn't a culture problem. There was just no culture. It was over. I mean, it was just a soulless football team. And the job that he did in year 1, going 7-6 and winning what is now the Birmingham Bowl, and playing teams close, and team played with a hell of a lot of heart, and there was a ton of culture, and he got buy-in, and he was a really good football coach. He is. I think he read too many of his headlines here. It got to his head. He made enemies. He made enemies in bad places to make enemies, and stuff got him, and he's paid for it. paid for it here. He paid for it for several years, and he gets an opportunity at Auburn. And I don't doubt that he will do well. I don't know that, and you referenced this, I don't know that Auburn, given how much they have to improve in a division where nobody sucks.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, that's the one thing about the whole division, from Alabama to Arkansas to Auburn to LSU to Ole Miss to Mississippi State to Texas A&M. Nobody sucks. Nobody's
Mm-hmm.
bad. And so if nobody's bad, it's just so hard to get wins that I don't know that they can make that type of a leap where they're a contender. But if you told me that Auburn wins a game this year that nobody thinks they'll win, I'd say, yeah, it's Hugh Freeze's teams. Now, as you referenced, the flip side of that is his teams typically lose a game that no one thinks they'll lose. His Liberty team went to ULM and lost. You know what I mean? I mean, his Ole Miss team, he had an Ole Miss team that beat Alabama and lost to Memphis.
Yep.
You know what I mean? I mean, went to Alabama and won, lost to Memphis. So, I mean, his teams are he's an emotional coach, and emotional coaches, you ride the wave. And
Mm-hmm.
but yeah, no, he's good. It's a league full of really good teams and good coaches, and he fits in it. He would have had this opportunity before had the thing at Ole Miss not gotten as nasty as it did. So
Mm-hmm.
yeah, he's going to do well. Let's talk about Ole Miss for a minute. I want to get your thoughts on them. Obviously they bring a lot back offensively, bringing in new receivers that are sort of unproven at this level. Trey Harris was an elite receiver at Louisiana Tech. They brought in Zachary Franklin from FAU. I mean, I'm not FAU, but there's so many guys that I get confused as to where they all came from. From one of the conference facilities.
We can't even say Chris Marshall anymore.
Can't say, and Marshall was their best receiver in the spring. So
Right.
they're unproven at receiver at this level, but they've got probably the best running back in the country. Certainly one of the best 2 or 3 running backs in the country.
Mm-hmm.
Whether it's Jackson Dart or Spencer Sanders, they have a proven quarterback. They have depth at that position. They're good up front. Micah Pettis is an underrated offensive lineman that people will start talking about more and more. Jeremy James is back for another season. They're good up front. They're solid. A lot of unproven guys on defense. 14 transfer portal additions on defense. Pete Golding, a new defensive coordinator. Just kind of what are your thoughts and expectations for Ole Miss going into the fall?
Well, I think you had me on about this time last year, Neal, and we talked about Ole Miss, and I'll say the same thing I said then. They are the toughest team, in my opinion, to get a read on, and I always seem to be wrong about them, and it's because of the transfer portal, and because they got so many guys coming and going, and the changes at coordinator now on the defensive side. Yet again, it's almost impossible to accurately predict. But they exceed expectations nearly every season, and they would have done it last year had they been able to close a little bit stronger.
I'm going to correct myself. Zachary Franklin was UTSA, not one of the Florida schools. See, just in my mind, I was looking for initials. My bad. Yeah. Continue on.
But I will say this, Neal, that in all my time covering the SEC, I don't think there's a coach that is more willing to adapt to his personnel and does a better job of that than Lane Kiffin. And the perfect example I can give you, I may get my years mixed up here, but I think it was 2014, Alabama. They had Blake Sims, who was a running back before he was a quarterback. I mean, he was not a great passer, obviously, but they had this guy named Amari Cooper, and they decided, let's throw him the ball 120 times, and it worked to perfection. And then the very next year at Alabama, they said, well, we don't got Amari Cooper, but we got this beast called Derrick Henry, and they just rode him. So, I mean, no one adapts to his personnel better and maximizes those pieces better than Lane Kiffin. So, yeah, I mean, I am hearing from many people it's incredibly hard for a running back to win the Heisman. And I'm not sitting here saying Judkins will, but I keep hearing buzz that he is legitimately that good to where, he's obviously not a kick returner and things of that nature, but he could put up the kind of stats. And if Ole Miss has a big year, you've got to keep your eye on Judkins to win the Heisman. I've heard the same things that your entire audience has heard about Jackson Dart in the spring. Just it seems to have, the light, so to speak, has come on. He's committed himself to being a better player, and I don't think he was a bad player last year. I just think, he got hurt, and it felt, the wheels kind of fell off there. That he would make 3 or 4 incredible throws, and then he'd make one. You're like, what the hell is he thinking? What's he seeing there? Eliminate those plays, and apparently he only threw like 1 or 2 interceptions in the entire spring. If he can take that next step, I think, we Lane Kiffin. That's another thing we got to credit him for. I mean, he gets the most out of these quarterbacks. I didn't quite believe he got that last year, but I think it was just the hand they were dealt there. But all they need Pete Golding here to make this defense average, because with the offense they have, they're going to be very good if they have an average defense. We just can't be god awful on defense like we have been. And say what you want about Pete Golding, Alabama fans, glad to see him gone. But again, are we really going to believe that this wasn't Nick Saban's defense and that Nick Saban was the one with the ultimate authority, or are we to believe that this young coach he also, I believe they hired him from UTSA,
Yeah.
was running the Alabama defense, and Nick Saban was just had his back turned to the play or something stupid like that? No, I think, again, I mean, I don't think he did a great job for Alabama, but he didn't do a horrible job either. And I think he is significantly more qualified than the previous defensive staff that Lane Kiffin had. So again, we just got to be an average defense. We've got some nice pieces that we can get that done. And there's no reason that if all this clicks together, that Ole Miss can't win 9, 10 ball games. Unfortunately for them, they catch Georgia out of the East this year. I mean, that's death to anybody that gets Georgia this year.
One of the things I'm interested in with Ole Miss is, and it's something that there's no way to answer it until midway through the season, if then, is, Lane talked last year a lot about chemistry, culture. It was very clear that he was talking about it a lot because it was a concern on his part. And yet last year, because the schedule was kind of backloaded, the only real challenging game in the first half of the season was Kentucky. Ole Miss survived it, won it. They ended up 7-0, and so it kind of felt like they were really rolling, and yet turns out they probably had some culture issues because they lose big at LSU in the second half, come back, they hold off Texas A&M and College Station, get the win. Then everything went downhill from there. They lost to Alabama. They didn't recover from that. They lost to Arkansas. They lost the Egg Bowl. They lost to Texas Tech in the bowl game. And you started hearing a lot of rumblings about kind of culture stuff and things of that nature. And when you bring in this many transfer portal guys, culture's a harder thing to build just because there's so many people from so many places. This is Lane talking, not me. And the front part of the schedule this year is harder. A trip to Tulane, then I think they'll be fine, but Tulane's a good team. They've got Alabama early in the season. They've got LSU early in the season. They got Arkansas at the end of the front half. Then they get a break, and then they go into the second half. But what happens if they lose a couple of those games? Say they lose to Alabama and LSU. It's not a reach. That they lose to Alabama and LSU, and they're 4-2 at the turn. What do they have enough team chemistry and culture to go into the second half of the season and go on a run, or having a couple of losses where, hey, getting to Atlanta is not realistic right now? Do you lose a little bit of that? That's what I'm interested to see. And I'm not predicting that it will go down that way, but what if it did is kind of what I wonder about.
Mm. Well, to your point though, Neal, I remember when he first got there. Of course, the COVID year is such an outlier. It's kind of hard to take anything from that. But I do remember specifically going into camp, he's like, I don't even know most of these guys' names because they don't allow us access, and we can't do this, we can't do that. So I was sitting here thinking, by God, I mean, Ole Miss, they're not going to win a game. This sounds awful. And then, I mean, they came out lights out on offense. I mean, they weren't necessarily winning all those games, but that was the game where I believe they caught Florida right out the gate, and that was the best Dan Mullen-led Florida team ever. That was the game where they went back and forth with Alabama, which won, of course, the national championship, went undefeated. So Yeah, I mean, I try not to read too much into Lane's. Again, that goes back to what I was saying. Lane Kiffin, I think he's a little bit of a poker player too. So I think he chooses what he says very closely, and that's evident when you see the pressers he does with guys like you, and then he'll go on Paul Feinbaum or Pardon My Take or whatever, and he seems like personality's completely different. So uh,
Because he hates
he's a hard.
he hates local media. He despises us. I mean, he hates us. It's one of those things too, man. The whole media thing. I get this question all the time. Like, I bet covering Lane is really fun. I'm like, covering Lane could be really fun. It's it's the guys on the beat. Bless them. They mean no harm. They are determined to ask personnel questions.
Mm-hmm.
He hates them. And so what happens is you get, and as beat writers, we have to ask some of those questions. They have to be asked. And I get it. But sometimes it's just like, okay, you can tell he's not in the mood to do this today.
Right.
So don't ask him about, hey, how you're using the tight end or what's going on with the defensive stunt or something. You're not going to get that. He's going to go into his shell and it's over. It's wiped out. And so then you have days when you ask a big picture question and you get a big picture answer and you can tell, hey, he's engaged. And then it's like, okay, well, maybe now one of you cats can slip something in and get a little bit, but he is different, right? He goes on with Paul or someone like that and he turns it on. And it's not just that he turns it on, it's just that the conversation's more interesting to him.
Mm-hmm.
And so that's the challenge of covering Lane is you've got to ask some interesting questions. You've got to ask some relationship questions like, hey, not just his relationship with Saban, which is played out, but he'll talk about the Jimbo thing. You just got to ask. You got to stay on it, and you can ask questions about previous games and things and stuff like that, and he'll talk about that. But it's hard on a beat where the people are passing the microphone around, and you've got people that are determined to ask those kind of tedious questions, and you just lose him. And then he spends his press conference talking like this, just kind of looking around and his nails. And, yeah, I don't know about that. And then 10 minutes later, you hear him on Dan Patrick, and he's animated, and it's like, God, he hates us. I understand it, really. I mean, I do. But yeah, he's an interesting cat. But he'll also tell you the truth. And so when he talks about culture and stuff like that, those are not just buzzwords. He wonders about it. And, you go around the league and you listen to coaches that are talking about how much they use the portal, how much they don't use the portal. I have some coaching friends that I talk to who they just don't really like depending on it for that reason. They're like, I'm not criticizing it because obviously Lane's won, right? I mean, he went 10-2, then he went 8-4. He's winning. 18 wins in 2 years at Ole Miss is strong.
Mm-hmm.
So he's using the portal well. But there are just coaches that look at it and go, man, it's a recipe for disaster. It's like the old days of being heavily dependent on JUCOs. They just come into your program. They're not super invested. And if things don't go well out of the gate, they just sort of quit on you. And I think that's what I'm interested to see. But listen, Ole Miss is not the only program. I'm looking at all your helmets up there. Auburn went heavy on the portal. Arkansas went heavy on the portal. Kentucky went heavy into the portal. There's a bunch of Tennessee, as you mentioned, was in the portal a lot. I mean, there's a lot of teams in the portal that the whole culture building thing is very real. It's a real concern for Lane Kiffin's not the only coach that puts his head on the pillow at night and wonders, hey, is this going to work?
Yeah, and Neal, I mean, we just live in a world, and these coaches are no different, where sometimes what's new scares you, and if there's not data to back up, you could build your roster by taking X amount of transfers, but you got to have X amount of high school guys. I mean, this is all new, so there is no hard evidence that what he's doing is going to work. But I would argue that, again, not saying anything, this is not revelations or anything, but they are in the toughest division in college football, in the toughest conference. They're recruiting and playing against the elite of the elite, and they're just not going to win many head-to-head recruiting battles consistently over Alabama, LSU, Georgia, A&M, and probably Texas and Oklahoma even. So you kind of have to do it a little bit different
Yeah.
at
No,
Ole Miss.
history absolutely supports what you're saying. Agree completely. Yeah. I mean, if there will be some fans that push back against that. And I'm like, well, I mean, history backs that up. It doesn't mean that it can't change one day and you get to a
Right.
place where but historically they've not recruited tremendously well against those programs head to head. That's just a
Right.
fact.
And you're going to win some. I'm not saying you'll lose them all, but
Sure.
just I'm saying consistently it's that if you just want to go the high school route, you're going to be a lower tier SEC West program, and that's why I like what he's doing with the transfer portal. Cannot wait to see how that works in the long run, because that is a giant mystery to us all. But I did want to ask you something, Neal, about Lane Kiffin specifically. I don't know if you had seen this or not, but in the new Athlon Sports College Football Preview magazine, my favorite section is the anonymous coach comments, and they have one on Ole Miss, of course, and it in there. I don't remember it verbatim, but essentially the anonymous coach, who is allegedly an SEC assistant, says Lane Kiffin, a top 5 play caller in, I think he said, modern college football or college football history, which I think you could probably, you can see where he gets at.
Sure.
But he also says he's been not a disappointment, I don't think is the word, but not nearly as good a head coach. And I'm just curious, without with me butchering the comment there, your thoughts on that. Top 5 all-time play caller, but maybe a little bit of a disappointment as a head coach. What's your thoughts on that?
Well, I can only. I'm like you. I throw out 2020. I really pay, and as we go further away from 2020, I pay less attention to it. I'm more inclined to just completely dismiss it, good and
Mm.
bad for everybody. I thought the job that he did as a head coach in 2021 with Matt Corral and those guys was elite. And then last season, like I referenced, the back end of that schedule was hard. Um, the defensive system that they ran made it to where you could run against them, and teams did. They lacked some personnel. It's a total rebuild. He inherited a program that, I mean, look, Hugh Freeze burned it to the ground there at the end. People didn't get to see that because Matt Luke was the interim coach, but it was bad. Frankly, the job that Luke did in his interim coach year was pretty elite. And then, Ole Miss stuck with Luke a couple more years, the rest. And so it just didn't really work. And the roster wasn't great when Kiffin got here. It's been a rebuild. The portal, frankly, has been a godsend for him because it's prevented him from having to do a rebuild.
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. You can't give him credit for 10-2 and then not take some points away from losing 5 of their last 6 games last year. There were some head coaching moments last year, and I've talked about them, where I questioned what the motivation was. The one that really comes to mind to me, and I'm convinced that they lost 2 games that Saturday night in Fayetteville. That game was 42-6, I think, in the third quarter. You're not coming back from 42-6. You're not winning that game. You had a game in 5 nights, and the Auburn stuff was percolating, and all of that was going on. And I don't, as of this moment, I mean, I know what I think, but I have people who I trust who tell me I'm wrong, and I have people who I trust who tell me I'm right. So I don't know. But that night at 42-6, if you're thinking about the program, and you beat Mississippi State, you go 9-3. 9-3 puts you in the Citrus Bowl or the Outback Bowl or whatever. I mean, a better bowl than the Texas Bowl. You're not coming back that night. A mature head coach in that moment, as hard as it is, looks across the sideline, across the field to the other sideline, and essentially says, all right, Sam, I'm going to get you in Oxford next year, but tonight's yours. Why don't we get out of here? We play in 5, you play in 6. Let's get out of here. Instead, they had 98, I think, offensive snaps, chasing points. Yes, they lost 42-27, which sounds a lot better than 42-6, but it's still an L.
Yeah.
It's the same L, right? You weren't coming back to win that game, and that's the one moment that I'm like, you got to grow up as a coach right there. And he kind of did it against LSU late in the game. They were getting beat, and he doesn't. He's hyper competitive, like most great coaches. But man, there comes a point where you got to get your guy off the field. Sam Pittman did this last year. That same Alabama game that we talked about. That game went from, hey, Arkansas's back in this thing to Arkansas's out of this thing, like in a hurry. And he left Jefferson in the game, and Jefferson got hurt, and Jefferson couldn't play in Starkville, and they weren't competitive in that game. You sometimes do have to get your guys off the field, and he didn't do it. So that would be the only thing that I've watched in 2 years that I could really criticize. Other than that, I think he's done a really good job. He's absolutely an elite play caller. He's a genius offensively, no question about it. Is he growing as a head coach? Yeah, I think so. To a degree, I think he is. I mean, he's certainly more engaged in the program today than I think he was a couple of years ago. I think the truth is, Michael, that Lane believed when he got here that this would be a short stay, that this was a launching pad to a bigger job. And it almost was. And I think it could have been. I think the Auburn job was his if he'd wanted it. And ultimately, for whatever reason, whether it was because something changed, whether it was because of family, whether it was because Auburn didn't offer the kind of money that ultimately I think he wanted to get offered, maybe some combination thereof, he's not the coach at Auburn today. He's still at Ole Miss. And now I think he's starting to view Ole Miss as, hey, this might be a place where I stay a long time. And so there's a different investment level. And that's not a criticism. I get it. When I took this job at Rivals, if you had told me then that I would still be here 16 years later or whatever it is, I said, you're out of your mind. I mean, I thought 2 years, 3 years, I'll go get another, I'll leave, I'll cover somebody else. That's what I thought. I mean, so I don't criticize Lane for that at all, but I don't know that I would say that he's done I would say he's done a really good job. Is he an elite head coach yet? Well, clearly not, because he hasn't won the big game. I mean, you got to go down to LSU and win that game. You got to go to Tuscaloosa and win, or beat them here. Like last year was so much on the line in that game. The fourth quarter got away from them, but it was just Bryce Young. Bryce and look, you're right. Bryce Young did do special things. He was the first pick in the draft. The Carolina Panthers could have picked anyone, and they picked Bryce Young. You know what I mean? I mean, so it's to me, the last half of the season, everybody gets hung up on the Auburn part of it, and I'm not saying that wasn't a factor. I just think they put so much into the Alabama game, lost it, had a hard time getting over it. The Auburn thing was out there. They went to Arkansas. The part that we don't ever give enough credit to is that KJ Jefferson and Sanders and that offensive front that night were really, really good. And it was senior night at Arkansas. It was their environment. It was cold, all of that stuff. And Arkansas played really well. We don't ever give credit to the other part of it. They played really well that night. They were an average team that had a lot of disappointing losses. And that night they kind of put it together for the first half, certainly. And they just blew Ole Miss off the field. And there were some calls that didn't go Ole Miss's way. And it was one of those nights where it was Arkansas's night and it wasn't Ole Miss's night. And then, like I told you, they just kept chasing points. And I thought they were tired against Mississippi State, and they lost a super close game. Then throw the bowl game out. They didn't want to be there, and Texas Tech did, and you saw what happened.
Yeah, and I was going to say, to your point of, maybe coming up short in the big games, we all live, it's an instant gratification. And, it's one thing if you're Chad Morris and you can't win a damn game. I mean, we don't need to give those people time, but clearly you see the strides that Ole Miss has made. And perfect example, maybe not the perfect comparison because it's different programs and everything, but for years, Kirby Smart was the guy could not win the big game.
Yeah.
Literally no one remembers that now because they won it twice. And, where many people, myself included, think He's probably the game's best coach right now. I mean, it's kind of hard to argue with a guy that's won 2 in a row. But 3, 4 years ago, he was the guy that couldn't win the big game. So sometimes you got to just keep chopping at that wood and change that narrative.
Yeah, no, it's a great point. I mean, he hasn't been here very long. If you kind of dismiss the 2020 season, and I do, this is going into his third year.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, had a big season in with Corral and those guys, and then last year, he brought in Dart and Judkins and all of them, and they got off to a hot start, and LSU popped them really good. But if they beat Alabama that day, who knows what happens? I mean, that game was a fourth quarter game that, again, Bryce Young won it, and it doesn't work like that. But I mean, we have a tendency, as you said, we kind of live in a hot take business.
Mm-hmm.
Where, you lose a close game and that's the end of the world. They suck. Win a close game. Oh man, here they come. No, I mean the game was decided by a few plays, man. I mean, there wasn't a hell of a lot of difference between a bunch of SEC teams last year. If you go back and look at games, like the Ole Miss Kentucky game. I mean, think of how Kentucky's season is different if Will Levis just hesitates a beat. Well, they score a touchdown right there and they win the game.
Mm-hmm.
And they come out of Oxford top 6, 7 in the country, sky high. Instead, that loss kind of took something out of the sails from them. We could do this on a bunch of teams like, Alabama. Say Texas holds on and wins. Say Jimbo calls the right play. They lose to Texas A&M. And suddenly we're talking about a 4-loss, a 5-loss Alabama.
Mm-hmm.
Arkansas loses the A&M game. Cam Little misses the field goal off the upright. Let that ball go, an inch or so on the inside, and Arkansas wins that game. And instead of being super deflated that night in a way that they had a hard time kind of coming back from that, well, now they're rolling. I mean, that's one of the reasons we love it is that sports is. Look at South Carolina a year ago. I mean, they got thumped early a little bit, then they kind of lost some close games, and then at the end, man, they were world beaters.
Yep.
They beat Clemson, they beat Tennessee. They looked on top of the world at the end of the season. So I just think there's so much hot takiness and not enough in our field, not enough. Hey, it's hard to win. It's hard to go from good to great, from good to really good, from really good to great, and then to stay great. To your point about Kirby, I mean, it's one thing to win it once, man. When you win it that second time, like you did, that's far more impressive because everybody's got you in the crosshairs now. And, it's the greatness of Saban, what he's done for, 2 decades practically at Alabama is the Alabama game's a big game for everybody all the time. And so you always get people's best shot. And no, I think Kiffin's growing as a coach, and it's just, it's a hard league to stair step in.
Yeah, and another great example. I mean, if Ohio State makes that field goal, Georgia doesn't win the championship. And the year previous had Alabama's top 2 receivers not blown out their knees. I mean, Alabama probably would have beat them in the title game. And we're sitting here saying, Kirby's on the hot seat.
We're back to doing the Kirby thing. Exactly. I mean, it's hilarious what we do, and yet look at this. I mean, this year, we're doing the Jimbo thing, and yet what's going to happen. Let's say that this is the year that they put it together in College Station, and they go off on some winning streak. We're all going to go, oh, Bobby Petrino, what a difference maker. No, yeah, but the point holds is that he has recruited a really talented roster. The truth is if Jimbo got fired and they opened that thing up down there for a coaching search, as crazy as the place is, and with the North Korean band and all the stuff, there would be so many coaches that would look at that roster and go, sign me up.
Neal, what's going to happen if Texas wins the Big 12? God forbid they're a playoff team, and A&M goes 6-6. They got to fire him, right? You cannot have the Longhorns coming in, the hottest team in the country, and we got Jimbo here with a top 5 roster going 6-6.
No, it's like you said, and they've got some weird games early. A&M does. The Miami game that you talked about, The
Yep.
Arkansas game in Jerry World, which is always a super competitive game, and Arkansas circles that game.
Hmm.
I mean, it's you look at A&M's schedule, and I can get them to 7-5 quick, no problem, easy. They got to go to Oxford.
Hmm.
I think Lane will be ready for Jimbo. Do you? Uh, I mean, and Jimbo will be ready for Lane, but someone's got to lose, and so
Right.
I could get them to 5 losses
They
quick.
play they play at Tennessee,
Yeah.
at
Um,
LSU.
yeah, LSU's going to want that game next year because
They
that.
can't beat Mississippi State to save their lives for some reason.
Well, no, the Mississippi schools get them all the time. I always laugh at my buddies at Texags, and they're good people. I enjoy all of them, but they get so pissed off at the Mississippi losses, and I'm like, you guys ought to be. This is kind of ought to be old hat to you by now. I mean, I mean, you've lost to Mississippi State and Ole Miss quite a bit. I mean, these scenarios should not be shocking to you anymore. And it's it's the part of the league that Texas and Oklahoma are in for a culture shock when they get there. Is that they're going to look at Kentucky and Missouri and Mississippi State and go W W. It ain't like that. It's not like that. Nope. All right, couple more things before I let you go. We've talked about a lot of SEC teams. We did not really dive into LSU at all, and we didn't dive into Arkansas at all. Let's start with LSU. I just not sure I see weaknesses. They're super talented. Jaden Daniels is back. Perkins is back at linebacker. It's Brian Kelly's second year. Typically, his teams are really good year two. Is there any chance that we're just overhyping them, or is this potentially a title contender?
No, I mean I'm on record. This is my team to win the national championship, the
Oh,
LSU Tigers,
wow.
year two under Brian Kelly. He came down to the SEC to win a national championship. I think he's driven to get there, and I mean they stunned me. Now they were not world beaters by any stretch last year, but they got it done in many games, and I think it's all the more impressive if you look at Florida State game. I mean, that was a debacle for 3.5 quarters. The Tennessee game at home, they just got whooped by Tennessee. Yet, never in a million years could I imagine the team that lost those two games was going to turn around and win the SEC West if they can just continue to build on that. Uh, Mason Smith, you said he's back. They lost him for the entire season. All the buzz was he's the best player on the team. They didn't even have him last year. But who they did have is Mekhi Wingo right next to him, who was an All-American on the defensive line. You mentioned Harold Perkins. He's probably the best defensive player in all of college football. And
You're a
they went
beast.
out and they added an all Pac-12 linebacker, Omar Speights from Oregon State, which won 10 games. He was team captain. Put him next to Harold Perkins. I mean, the star power on that defense is incredible. And one thing I think Jane Daniels certainly surprised me. I didn't realize how good he was. But just look across, all of college sports. But year two, same system, quarterback returns, a talented quarterback, they take a big step. And last year, that was Hendon Hooker, and I'm not saying that Jaden Daniels is Hendon Hooker 2.0, but I think we'll see a big step in his production. And even if we don't, I think they got the best backup quarterback, arguably, at least the most, the highest upside
Yeah,
backup in Garrett Nussmeier, not
agreed.
nearly as accomplished as maybe like a Spencer Sanders or someone like that. But I think Garrett Nussmeier could lead them as well to incredible heights. They just added a running back from Notre Dame, really good, Diggs, who of course Brian Kelly's familiar with. That offensive line was a travesty at the beginning of the year. Two true freshman offensive tackles. By the end of the year, that unit was a strength of the football team. So, I mean, the coaching is evident. The special teams was a disaster. Thankfully, they fired the special teams coordinator. As long as they're not a disaster on special teams again, I'm right there with you. I mean, I don't know that they have a weakness.
We didn't talk about Arkansas much at all. KJ Jefferson's back again. Sanders is back again. They're good up front. Got to replace a whole lot at receiver. And they bring in a ton of new faces on the defensive side. New defensive coordinator, new offensive coordinator. But Pittman's been there a while. He's got his quarterback back. Their schedule's not terrible. They're not winning the West, don't get me wrong, but they're one of the teams that I look at and go, well, last year they could have been a lot better than they were from a record standpoint. They lost a lot of kind of close games. What do you
Yeah.
expect from them?
Yeah, to your point, they were 2-4 last year in one-score games. That was the difference. Now, the year previous, they were 2-2. So, that's how you kind of go from 9 wins to 7. But this is another one that's very hard for me to put my finger on because I do think KJ Jefferson is, in my opinion, I think he's the best quarterback in the SEC. Now, does he have the weapons aside from an outstanding running back room and led by, of course, Rocket Sanders? But they go 4 deep at that running back position with legitimate SEC running backs. They return over 92% of the rushing production. So could be a very prolific offense. Again, we got to see what we got with some of these transfers at receiver. They had to do this last offseason, though, brought in totally reworked transfer receivers, and they had 2 guys, Hazelwood and Landers, that were in the top 10 in the SEC in receiving yards. So they have proven they can identify and plug these guys in, but it is a new system. And Kendall Briles, say what you want about him. I mean, I think Arkansas fans are happy to see him go. I think that might be a mistake because I do got respect for Dan Enos. I think he's a good offensive coordinator. I don't think he's near as good as Kendall Briles. And I think you could say the same thing at defensive coordinator,
Yeah.
Barry Odom. All the biggest wins of the Sam Pittman era were essentially won because Barry Odom schemed up an outstanding game plan and it was executed to perfection. And that's now gone. But
It's always
I
one of the
do,
first big questions, right? Big test of a head coach. You don't really know until they have to replace coordinators, and so he's replaced both. The
right.
the Briles thing is interesting because he would do some really creative stuff, and
Mm-hmm.
sometimes I thought he got too cute.
Yeah.
There were some moments in games where you're watching them and you're like, well, it's working, and then they'll try some trick play kind of thing, and it would derail what they were trying to do offensively. And sometimes that's just what really smart offensive coaches do. They fall in love with something on a blackboard and that we're running this, or I'm running it. I got to
Mm-hmm.
run it. And I don't know. Well, that's interesting. All right, I've kept you way too long. Let's talk just real fast. It's a simple question about the SEC East. Is there any scenario at all, whether it's Tennessee, Florida, South Carolina, whoever? Is there any scenario at all where the SEC West is at least up for grabs in November? SEC East, I should say.
The only scenario where I see that, Neil, is if Tennessee is elite again, which I'm a Tennessee graduate, and not even I am convinced of that because, as your audience knows as well, last time we saw Joe Milton, aside from the bowl game, in meaningful action, he ran out of bounds with the game on the line. I mean, it was the stupidest play I've ever seen in SEC history, perhaps. But
That game was drunk. Throw it, nope, throw it out. That game was totally trashed, man. That by the time that game got to the end, it was lit.
yeah,
That game was walking around. That game does not remember anything about itself that night.
yeah, yeah.
So nope.
I mean, the only scenario I could see that happening is, I mean, this is crazy to say because this is the SEC, but I think Georgia, the way their roster is built and their schedule is laid out, they play Ole Miss, which I think is a huge trap game because it's the week previous before going on the road to Tennessee. I think Ole Miss stands a shot of pulling an upset, but it is in Athens, so I'm not crazy enough to predict that, but I'm just saying keep your eye on that one. But I think we could get to a scenario deal where we don't know what we got at quarterback until the second to last game of the season, or at least they may think they know what they got, but they not truly been tested till they go up to Rocky Top. I mean, Tennessee would have to go undefeated, beat Georgia. I think that's the only possible scenario, and I think that's highly, highly, highly unlikely. So I think it will be Georgia, but another one to keep your eye on, I think Kentucky. I think that's the team people are sleeping on. I think they could win 9, possibly even 10 games if we want to count the bowl game. The problem with Kentucky is they have to go to Athens and they catch Alabama out of the West. So them winning the East is kind of inconceivable to me. But I do think they're going to be very, very, very good this year.
I do too, and I think South Carolina is going to be good. I think South Carolina is going to be interesting to see whether they can kind of keep the momentum that they finished the season with. Can they go into the season with something resembling that momentum and capitalize on it? And I like Shane Beamer a lot. That'll be interesting to see how he does. Speaking of people I like a lot, I like you a lot. I appreciate you doing this. Can't wait to see you in Nashville. I told you I'd be happy to come and talk to you at media days, and so I'd love to reciprocate at that time.
Absolutely, yeah. Can't wait to see it. And just a little plug for my show, real quick.
Please.
We're doing fall camp previews right now. This is the perfect time. So we spend an hour plus on each SEC team. We try to do our own kind of like preview magazine, obviously without the magazine. So we haven't done Ole Miss yet. We'll get to them soon, but just something for your audience if they want an hour straight of Ole Miss football, two lunatics talking about it. Be on the lookout over at that SEC podcast.
It's at that SEC podcast. You should absolutely add that to your podcast library as we approach the football season, and then the content's great year round. Really appreciate you. I'm a big fan of your work. So thanks for spending some time with us.
Absolutely. Anytime, Neal.
That was Michael Bratton of that SEC podcast. Please do check out his work if you get a chance. Great guy. Really appreciate him spending some time with me today on the show. Hope you enjoy the show. Again, this will be the Friday Oxford Exxon podcast. Hope you all have a wonderful weekend, a safe weekend, and we'll be back with you next week with another week of podcast here at MPW Digital. Until next time, take care.